We are live this Tuesday morning. Thank you. It's not morning, it's afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This is Tuesdays with Kamira. I am Kamira, and my guest today is Betsy Hill. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a really important conversation today. Um, thank you, Betsy. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Oh, I'm just delighted to be here.
We are talking about Betsy's new book, hot off the press. Here it is. I have a copy. Da-da-da-da. Your child learns differently. Now what? Really important topic, especially now that we are in our post-shutdown mode. COVID learning has happened. It is affecting children all over, and parents need to know what to do. Often, I hear that a lot of parents didn't know that their children were learning differently until the shutdown happened, and they started taking on the role of homeschooling, basically, because they had to help the teachers out when the kids were in virtual school. So they're learning things about their child's learning developmentally, what's appropriate, what isn't, things that they really didn't have to pay attention to before. Betsy, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure. So, and you're absolutely right. It was the shutdown, the pandemic, and all the virtual schooling was a real wake up call for a lot of parents. And most parents sort of trust that the school is going to take care of what their children need to know, what their learning process is going to be, the education part. I certainly know that I did. I raised 3 boys, and I learned probably more from raising them than anything else I've done in my life, including all of my education, my training. So I definitely have to thank them all the time, even though there were some rough spots in there. But what we do is really focus on what we call cognitive skills, and these are the skills that we use to learn. They're the how we learn. So school tends to focus on the what we learn. We have to learn to read, we have to learn to write, we have to learn to do math, we have to learn, all the various iterations of standards that everybody has gone through. And that's the what. But the how we learn is something different. And kids don't always learn simply because a teacher stands in front of the classroom and says, here's what you need to know. So these cognitive skills are the processes our brains use to take in, process, understand, store, retrieve, apply information. So things like attention. So I know a lot of parents are very familiar with the idea of whether or not their kids pay attention or can focus. That's a pretty obvious one, but there are others. Things like working memory, for example, which is how we hold information in our mind while we think about it, or visual span or processing speed. Those are things these are all ways that our brains process information to help us learn it. And if they're working efficiently and accurately, that's great. You get a good start to the learning process. Things just sort of happen. But for many kids, there are some weaknesses. And in fact, we all have cognitive strengths and weaknesses. You do, Kamira. I do. Everybody does. And so when we understand that and can help kids strengthen those skills, that's really what we're all about, and how we help kids become more capable and confident as learners.
Okay. Now, what is it that parents need to know or to look for when they're considering their child's cognitive skills? Which ones need to be bolstered? Which ones are right on target? What do we need to look for and know? And then we'll get into what should we be doing.
Sure. So parents usually, and moms especially, often have an inkling that something isn't working, quite the way that it ought to be. So you may get a report from. Well, here's the thing that I heard the most often when I would go to parent-teacher conferences, and I would come home and share with my children what I'd learned. And usually it was about they're not working to their potential. And in fact, they heard it so many times that my kids started calling it the P word, potential. because what it really meant is, what they're really saying is, you're lazy. You're not working hard enough. All you need to do is work harder. So if you hear that kind of thing, or if you have a child who just can't get started on their homework, or you have a child that doesn't, can't remember things from one day to the next, or that if you give them a set of instructions, they might remember, go up and please get my, your sweater and then your spelling list and your soccer shoes and meet me downstairs, and then we'll get in the car and go to soccer practice. A lot of kids will remember the first thing maybe, and then they look at you like deer in the headlights. What am I supposed to do now? And those are all symptoms. One of the things that parents can do is we do have a free cognitive rating scale on our website. So if you go to mybrainware.com and you just type into the search bar, type rating scale. That's probably the easiest way to find it. And that's free. It'll take you maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And what it does is it asks you to evaluate your child relative to his, other kids that on things that you can readily observe. And that's a good way to get sort of a first indicator about whether there might be some areas of concern.
So let's repeat that, because the Mexico will put the links in the comment section. Can you repeat the URL, the website, and the instructions?
Yeah, mybrainware.com. And brainware is like it's the word brain, and ware, W-A-R-E. So you can think about it this way. You have hardware, you have software, and you have brainware. So mybrainware.com, and they'll go to the top in the little search bar and just type in rating scale.
And that tool will help us understand what we should be looking for with our children.
Yes, so that is a series of statements, and it's things like, for young children, my child colors within the lines, or, remembers, can tell you the details of a story they just read. So things that you can readily observe that are indicative of cognitive development.
Okay. Now, what if, especially, I hear this a lot, it happened during the shutdown a lot. Parents of older kids, maybe anywhere from 11 to 16, were unaware that their child was learning differently, which I love. We're going to hold up the book again. It's learning differently instead of incorrectly or wrong or challenged or all the other terms we used to use.
Mm-hmm.
What do parents of these older students need to be looking for? Because the clues may be different.
The clues can be different because kids, when they get into near those adolescent teenage years, often are less transparent. How are you? Fine. What did you do at school today? Not much. You get these, monosyllabic answers, these very short things. And kids don't want you to know, and they don't want anybody to know, frankly, that they're struggling. And what has happened, especially if kids learn differently over time, they have built up, their perceptions of themselves and as learners are, well, I can't do that. And they would rather sort of struggle without telling anybody than, because what it says to them, and kids have this idea just the same way that adults do, I'm smart or I'm stupid. That's right. We divide. If you ask any child who the smart kids in the class are or who the dumb kids in the class are, they will give you names. And if they're dumb, they're going to say, I'm dumb. And when they're, 8, 9, 10, you'll hear I'm just stupid. I just can't do that. When we get into those tween and teenage years, then you often will simply see academic performance start to decline. They sort of give up. You may hear about assignments not being turned in. They may just avoid it. They may do really oh, I did my homework, but it's just very minimalistic because it's such an effort for them to do it. Or you will hear them talking others down. Oh, well, I don't need to learn that. That's not important. So they sort of deflect that away from themselves, because if they're not good at it and it is important, that's a problem. And they don't, we don't want to admit that that's the case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You have here, I'm holding up the book again. Mm-hmm. On the bottom here, we have the 5-step plan. And this is for parents and caregivers. This is the instructions on what we're supposed to do. Now, I know that we need to buy the book to read the whole plan, and we do have a link to the book in the comment section. But can you talk to us about the 5-step plan and how that helps?
Sure. So what we have found over time as we've worked with families is that there are some things that they have in common when they have been successful. And so we focus a lot on cognitive skills, which we talked about just at the beginning of our discussion today. But what is the case for most parents is they're not aware of what cognitive skills are. They've never really thought about this. They've never really thought about how their child learns. They may know that they've struggled with it, or that there's a homework battle, or that their kids are not doing as well as they'd like, and things like that. But so step one is the education system is not solving this for most children. And so step one is for parents to take the wheel. And parents may feel a bit reluctant to do this. I'm not an educator, they might say, or I don't know about this. Isn't the school supposed to be doing this? But the fact of the matter is that only about 35% of students in the US are reading proficiently at grade level. Only 35%. So 65%, the majority of kids, are not. So, and the education system, as I think I said before, focuses on what and not why. And so there is, in fact, nobody that cares more about your child than you do. There's nobody that is willing to and has the ability to help and support them at the end of the day. And if you're not getting help from somewhere else, you need to do it. You have to sort of take that wheel back that you handed over when they went on the school bus off to kindergarten or first grade. And so that's step one. The step two is to keep high standards. One of the things that tends to happen, and that is also sort of exacerbated by what schools do, or increased by what schools do, is focus on what kids can't do and sort of relax those standards. So we tend to expect less. We say, oh, well, we're just going to make it a little bit easier. And when children, especially if they are in special education or have a 504 plan or an individualized education plan, any of those kinds of supports, they say, oh, we're going to give them some ways to work around it. We're going to give them less, more time on the tests. We're going to give them, and not that some kids don't need that, because they may very well, to support them. However, if we start to say to ourselves, oh, well, they're just not going to be able to do that, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So step two is to keep those high standards and find the resources and the support, because children can strengthen their ability to learn. And that's sort of about step three, is to make sure that we understand that intelligence is not fixed. We aren't stuck with what we come to the classroom with. And cognitive skills can be developed to a far greater degree than most people understand. And so that's step three, has to do with building cognitive skills and the infrastructure for learning. But you wouldn't build a house without building a foundation first, because what would happen? Falls down, right? No, it's a mess, not a good thing. And the same is true for learning. So these skills, things like attention and working memory and visual processing, are all the foundation. They're what allows us to build everything we know on top of that, and to do it effectively and so that it's enduring. And so that's what that next step is all about.
Okay. And step 4?
Step 4 is move beyond grit. And so grit has become a really popular thing to talk about. We have to have, and the pandemic gave this all to us in spades. You don't like it, get over it, get grit. You're just going to have to power through. You have to try, you have to work. And the answer is, so there's interesting research that has to do with something called growth mindset. And growth mindset is understanding and believing that intelligence and talent aren't fixed. It's about understanding and believing that you can change your underlying intelligence, but with the right kinds of strategies. So what you do is you don't just try again. You don't just try harder and harder. You try smarter. You do something different, and you change your strategy. So when you say to a child, "Oh, just try again," if they're going to try again in the same way that wasn't productive the first time, what happens? They get discouraged. And the more they hear it, the more say, "I can't try anymore. I'm trying. And in fact, most kids with learning differences are trying. They try really, really hard, but they aren't getting it the way that it's happening, coming at them. So that's that. And then the fifth step is to invest in a coach. And this really has to do with the whole idea that we all need a coach. We all need a mentor. If you look at any of the elite athletes, they all have, Michael Jordan has a coach, Tiger Woods has a coach, Mia Hamm has a coach. All of these athletes have coaches and support. And it's when you work on improving cognitive skills, it's not always easy. It's a little bit of work, but it can be very fun too, and it can be incredibly rewarding. When you finally can do something and you can get it, and it's. I remember one story. There was a young lady who had really struggled with working memory, holding information in her mind. And so what that meant is when she would be sitting and doing her math homework, she would copy a problem and she would read the problem, 358 plus 79. And she could only remember one letter at a time. So she would go 3 and then write the 3, 5 and write the 5, 8 and write the 8. So obviously this was how she did it, what she was used to. And so after she had worked and improved her cognitive skills, she sat down to do her homework one day and she wrote 358 plus 79, 358 plus 79. And she went, "Mom, I got it. I could do it." And her mother was, amazed. But that's the kind of thing, is when it just is easier. It's not that struggle. And that's why having a coach and support along the way can really help you recognize when you've gotten to that point and keep you motivated through those times that it gets a little tough.
I love that example, because I made a note that I wanted a real world example. And I think I'm going to ask you for another one. But what I also love from that example is for our adults who are raising tweens and teens, is that you may not recognize your child's learning difference until they're older, because they've had wonderful coping skills when they were younger. The coping skills when you're younger are easy. There's a lot of memorization, and there are things that they can do. It doesn't take, even if it takes them a little longer than other kids, it's not that noticeable until they're in middle school and high school, where the workload is such that a little longer means all night, or right. or transferring one number at a time doesn't work for algebra. It may work for addition, but it doesn't work for algebra. And that's why you may just be seeing it now. So it's not as if you weren't paying attention to your child before. Sometimes things aren't noticeable in the earlier ages. And I love what you said about intelligence and talent aren't fixed, meaning they're not stuck. We don't come out with all of our intelligence and talent. And you're going to be smart in math and you're going to be smart in English, although that's what we say about little ones, right? We say it all the time.
Oh, we do say it all the time. We say, oh, they're so talented. Oh, you have natural talent at doing that. Well, and there is true. There is a kernel of truth there, which is intelligence is affected by our genetics, and some of it is what we come into the world with, but it is the environment and what we do in our interaction with it is far more impactful than we have any idea. And if we treat it that way, we know that talents are not the people that we usually think of as prodigies, Mozart or Einstein or things like that. The fact of the matter is they also learned very differently. In fact, Einstein was told when he was young that he would never amount to anything. And they thought he was, the term they used at the time, which would not use today, was retarded. And that he would not be able to do anything. But his mind worked differently. And what has happened is that all these people who are so good at things have spent enormous amounts of time working on it and nurturing and developing that talent. And so just because you can't do something the first time or the 10th time or the 157th time or the 2000th time, if you want to do it and you keep at it and you have the right coach and you work in it the right way, it's pretty amazing what we can accomplish.
Absolutely. So if we are the parents, caregivers of these tweens and teens, and we notice something, we're not quite sure what it is, but we notice that there's a difference in their learning, or we notice that their difference, which we've seen all along, is now impacting them in ways it didn't before. You say step one is take the wheel. We're taking the wheel. What do? Do we go to the school and say, this is what you're going to do, or?
Yeah, well, so you certainly can go to the school, and I would, that is, but there's a different kind of conversation and about than typically happens during parent-teacher conferences. And the other thing is that you will probably need to schedule a different kind of a meeting, because parent-teacher conferences are like 10 or 15 minutes these days, especially for those. And you're not going to.
That's a really important point. I think that's the first step, that you're scheduling a different type of meeting. So you're taking the wheel means you're going to go outside of this normal structure. It's not going to be during that parent-teacher conference where the other parents are waiting outside in the hallway for you to finish your time.
Right.
You're scheduling a specific meeting.
The teacher's got her or his, eye on the watch, and the seconds are ticking, and it's like, yeah. And they're so eager to tell you about what your child has done or not done. And it's you. In my experience, you don't get enough of an opportunity to really have a conversation. And the conversation needs to be about why do you think it is that my child is doing this? And if the answer is they just need to work harder, what I, in my experience, is not just about working harder. There's probably something else going on. And you can also pull out a list of cognitive skills. And there's a list actually on our website also. If you just type, again, go mybrainware.com and type cognitive skills. And there's also a list at the very back of the book. So if you go to the index in the book, there's a list, but it's on our website as well. And just have the teacher take a look at those, glance through those and say, where do you think that, and I would have done this already for my child. I would have said, okay, I think my child is stronger in, I think their executive functions are weak, or I think their processing speed. They seem to be really smart when they reason, or they reason really well when you give them something that they can look at or a model to manipulate. But they really have difficulty when you're trying to explain something to them verbally. So when you start to look at those things, then you can have the conversation about, all right, so probably Johnny or Susie or Kevin or whatever is not getting it because they process information more effectively with a different set of skills. And how then, and so if you can get through that part of the conversation, then it becomes about how can you set them up for success? How can you set up an environment where they can, if they need, visual. So for example, most of us have either stronger visual or verbal memory. And we're all sort of familiar with the concept of memory. We all memorized information in school, right? And some of us spent a long time doing it, whether it was spelling words or vocab or whatever, history dates and all those kinds of things. And some people just remembered it, at least for the test. And some of us, may have really struggled with that kind of information. Well, if you know that you remember something better verbally or visually, so think about the typical assignment that you get from your teacher to learn new vocabulary. And this is especially the case for adolescents, because you're in that, you may have to take the ACT or the SAT someday, and there's going to be a lot of vocabulary on it. You got to memorize all this vocabulary. Well, what do teachers often do give you as an assignment to learn vocabulary? Write the word, write the definition of the word, write the word in a sentence. So did you ever get an assignment like that, Kamira?
I got assignments like that as a student and as a parent.
Right. And you already knew those words, so it's not your job to learn them. It's your child's job to learn them. So how do you do that? And so if you have a child that remembers visual information, you see a picture of something or a diagram, a graph, a chart, that's what sticks in their mind as opposed to verbal information. How good is that assignment going to be for them to learn vocabulary words? Not very good.
And these are the kind of things that we have to communicate with the educators, that when you give this assignment to my child this way, this is not the best way for them to learn the information, therefore they're not going to succeed.
Right. And it was the tricky thing is it was probably a really good way for that teacher, because so much of education is based on language and words, and that's probably how they learned it really well. But it's not how everybody learns it well. And the other thing, that there's a lot of research that says that if we just learn things one way with one sense, either in fact, it's helpful for everybody to have multisensory experiences. So if you read it and say it out loud, if you act it out, if you draw a picture and see it and say it, and you can think about it this way. So when information comes into our brain, it gets stored in all different places. So our visual system's at the back of our heads, and our auditory system is pretty much on the side of our heads. And our system where we think about things and make decisions is more towards the front. And our motor cortex is up here on top. And when we take in information, we experience it, it gets stored in all those different parts of our brain. So if we have a store of information or ways to access it in different parts of our brain, then when we have to remember it, it's more likely we can find it again.
Oh, I love that, because I do that myself. The older I get, the more often I try to do something more than one. So I'll say it as I'm writing it, and things that you just suggested for our students helps with us at different ages. I just want to remind our parents who are out there, we're about ready to wrap up, that if you were stalled when we said talk to your child's teacher because you have a middle schooler or a high schooler, remember, if they're in middle school, they probably have a home-based teacher. But if they don't, they have a learning specialist in school or a counselor or the vice principal. So don't feel as if there's nobody for you to go to. Please make sure that you go to these different people. And what you want to talk about, courtesy of Betsy, is you want to talk about your child's processing and the skills that they need to learn the information, not just that this is the information and they're not doing the assignment. This is, so you want to spend some time with your child and spend some time with the person of choice to discuss how your child is processing information, because you want to take their processing information, the skills that they need to work with their sense of processing in order for them to succeed academically. Did I do that right?
You did that extremely well. You got an A+.
Oh, yay. I'm going to tell my kids that. I got an A+ today. This is very, very helpful. I know it's dense for people when we start talking about the brain and stuff. It's a lot easier when we talk about social issues in school and, these emotional social issues, but the brain is important too. So I really thank you for joining us today. I'm going to hold your book up again to show everybody, because I get excited. I usually read.
And it turns out the brain is responsible for emotions too, and how we interact with our emotions. And so when you understand that, and especially if you understand what's going on with the adolescent brain, that's another thing we talk about on our. We have a webinar and some other information if parents are interested on that website again.
Wonderful. So you guys go to the mybrainware.com website. The link is in the comment section. Thank you for joining us. Betsy, thank you so much for taking time with us today.
Oh, Kamira, it was great. I love talking with you.
I love speaking with you too. Everybody, thank you again, and we'll see you next time.